how you're wearing Obama socks.
Oh yeah, yeah. And my this is a gift from my wife a few years ago. They're pretty comfortable.
Oh, you're wearing Obama socks. Asking me about black people.
It goes all the way up. Yeah. It goes all the way up to my shins there.
Okay. Now that I saw the Obama socks, I think I'll tell you about how people viewed black people.
This is the Settlers of Seoul podcast. I'm your host, Arius Dare. This episode's guest is Robert Hamilton, a Ph.D. candidate in Sociology at Seoul National University. Robert's research focuses on geographies of sexualities, transnational sexuality, queer theory, and male prostitution. Robert has lived in Korea for nearly 20 years. He is also an African American, and we dive deep into what that means in Korea, how that's evolved over time, and what kind of obstacles and opportunities that presents. This is a really powerful interview, one of my absolute favorites we've done so far. There's a lot of territory covered, and some of which we just scratched the surface on. So I encourage all of you to do your own research and follow up on the themes discussed here. Things like languagism, acceptance, diversity of skin color, and homosexuality are all things Korea is being forced to confront as the country continues to evolve. Hopefully what you're about to hear will help make sense of it all. Okay, I give you Robert Hamilton.
Hey, thank you.
So could you give just a brief personal introduction of who you are, what you're doing here in Korea?
My name's Robert Hamilton. I'm a PhD candidate studying at Seoul National University. I major in sociology with a focus on gender studies and sexuality.
How did you first end up at Korea? There's obviously lots of places where you could study this kind of stuff.
I guess when I was young, I used to love watching Bruce Lee on TV, and every Sunday they had those kung fu movies on.
I know when I watch Bruce Lee, the first thing I think of is gender studies.
Yeah, not exactly. So I'm telling you first how I got to Asia. And this has nothing to do with gender studies at all. I was interested in Taekwondo, and Taekwondo was part of my life, like every 4 or 5 hours a day, all the way up until college. But during that time...
Were you good?
I was okay. I competed in nationals, did collegiate nationals, and I ranked pretty high. I did not go to the Olympic Training Center, which I lost that opportunity twice. That sort of was the beginning of my interest in Asia. I'm from Detroit, which is a black city, mainly. Most of my friends were black. I had like one Asian friend in elementary school, but even he saw himself as being more black. During that time, when I was young, I used to fantasize about the idea of speaking a foreign language, particularly Chinese or Japanese. And I started to teach myself. Well, after, of course, making my own sort of Asian language with my own view of what Asian language would be like. And in high school, I went to a school that taught both Chinese and Japanese as part of the electives. I went to college and thought, I'll pursue this along with a political science degree. And so I was majoring initially as a Chinese/political science major. I had never been to Asia, but I always wanted to go. And so I thought, let me go to the Asia Center and just ask them about it. And lo and behold, the person who worked there actually did Taekwondo. And he knew of me because at University of Michigan.
You were kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I was pretty well known in the community that I was good. And I wanted to go to Olympics. He was my first connection to the idea that I could really, really go to Asia. And he said, don't apply for the China program. We actually have better programs in Japan. And that they would pay me to go there because Japan was actually trying to increase the number of people who were going because so many Japanese were coming to America. And so they were paying students to go to Japan and to experience the Japanese authentic culture. And so I had the opportunity to do that. And so even
Can't get more authentically Japanese than Taekwondo.
Right? Yeah. And so I went to Japan. I was amazed at, the fact that I was just in Asia, but I felt like I was getting wholesale culture in some ways, seeing things that were very culturally Japan, sumo wrestlers. And we got to meet Konishiki, which was, he was the first Hawaiian non-Japanese person to win the highest honor of the sumo wrestlers. During that time, my best friend was Korean. He was extremely fluent in Japanese. And I was like, okay, he must be from Japan. But he was not. He said, I'm from Korea, and didn't really know where Korea was. He actually asked me where was it, and I said, somewhere around China, I think. I just had...
You've been taking Taekwondo for 20 years, and you didn't know where Korea was.
I did not. But you have to realize there are people in the world who play baseball, and they don't know where that's from. And they are not actually told that they should even care. Even basketball, for example. So I did not know the history of Taekwondo. I did it as a sport. I knew it was from Korea, but I didn't know where Korea was. He said, during the Christmas break, let's go to Korea. I was in Fukuoka, Kyushu University, and it's very close to Busan. And I asked him how we're going to get there. And he said, we're going to go by something called the Beetle, which was a fast moving boat. And he told me it'd take 5 hours. Now, I'm from Michigan. I go to Canada all the time. And I speak English well, and I think the Canadians speak English pretty well too. Well, when he said, that we're not the same and we speak different languages, I didn't really believe him, even though he said it. Even immediately before getting off the boat, I noticed, oh my God, this place is totally different from Japan. It was a total shock to me. And I knew that I was in for a culture shock, something that I didn't get in Japan, even though I went to Japan for that. People were everywhere. The organization of the country was extremely different from the case of Japan. There were no trees, no grass
Nicely
anywhere.
manicured boulevards.
Yeah, it was really something that I had not even prepared my mind to expect, because I didn't know anything about Korea except from the little bit of exposure I may have gotten from the TV show MASH in the United States, which was mainly more about a military base with Koreans once in a while sort of popping in and out, but always having the view of they're sort of modern, but sort of not modern. When I got to Korea in 96, it was extremely modern, but it was a very different type of modernity than I had expected of Asia. It wasn't like the sort of less developed countries, like the image that we usually have of Vietnam or Thailand or Cambodia. It really was a very Western looking place, but just a little bit lagging in terms of the time. So I was there in the 90s and I saw it more like the early 80s was the feeling that I got.
Now, was that a good thing, bad thing? I mean, did you enjoy your time there?
It was extremely, amazingly good and refreshing because I really wanted the Asian experience. And even though I wasn't in the country that I expected to get that Asian experience, it was life altering because I went back to Japan and I went back to my sort of well-prepared cultural experience and then went back to the United States. And I really wanted to learn more about Korea. There were scholars in Japan. There were scholars in China. I knew I always wanted to be a scholar, but I knew that I wanted to be a scholar of some place in Asia, maybe because of Bruce Lee, who knows. And so I went to the University of Michigan Asia Library, which is the biggest Asia library in the country, or at that time it was. I looked for books about Korea and I just wanted to learn about the people. And every book that I found was either written in circles and lines, which at the time I didn't know was Korean, or they were written about the war, which was like a 3-year period that I, honestly speaking, wasn't that interested in. So I went back to the Asia Center and I said, I'm going to do an extra year of college because I want to understand this country that I see I'm going to be an expert on. That was back in 1999. The guy told me, hey, we have 2 programs. We have one program for Yonsei University, the other one for Ewha Women's University. And he said, honestly, if you pick the Yonsei one, I feel a bit uncomfortable with you applying for that, even though your scores are excellent. There are people who way before you had an interest in Korea, and we kind of want to put those people in that program. Because Yonsei was known as being more international. And then they told me about this women's program, which I thought, wow, that'd be cool. Like going to a school, all women. He's like, hey, this program is for men. You are definitely allowed to go. And so I went to an all school, like all women's university, which was well known for being liberal, vocal, and extremely political. And I was a political science major at that time. And I got to experience classes with these women and that were taught in English. It started to dawn on me in these classes what nationality means. Because I always saw myself, even when I came to Korea, as being the black guy, that black man from America. But I never really made the connection that America means something to other people. And in the classes, these girls were very strongly pursuing their idea. And they would say, America did this, America did that. And of course, I'm looking at them like, I don't care. I'm American, but I didn't do it, right? I'm like, okay, yeah, they bad. Right? And so I started to realize that while they're talking, they would look in my direction. Right? Then there was another case where a Japanese student had given a presentation where she said Japan was responsible for the infrastructure of Korea. I saw it as a very idle statement that may have been factual.
Falsifiable or
viable.
Maybe worthy of further investigation.
Yeah, it wasn't really a big deal to me. It was just some kid explaining, her view of how Korea became a modern society. And in the next week, one student had prepared apparently hours worth of preparation and passed around a piece of paper at the end of the class with the professor having finished the class totally on a different topic, saying that she wanted to reply to the presentation that the Japanese girl did in the class. The Korean girl said, how dare you come to our country? How dare you say that you had done anything positive for us? How dare you present this in the way that you did without accepting the fact that you'd done anything bad? Now, honestly, in the class, I'm sitting there at first thinking to myself, well, hell, I went through slavery. We went through slavery, so we can always bring it up as well. But I was honestly taken aback of why this was relevant at the current time. If a guy like me, a black guy from America, can come here and say, look, we've been through hell and we all recognize that. It doesn't have to disrupt me going to eat lunch, And I never known that there was a real historical tension in what nationality meant until that very moment. Like, I knew that me being American meant something to those girls, but I didn't know how strongly invested Koreans were in their own national identity and how in many ways, in order to understand their national identity, they are forced in some ways to reject other nationalities. Whereas for me, race seemed to play a very similar role of I have to understand myself by taking my culture and making it something that it is not, or something that it is, but based on the fact that it is not something else. And I realized that in some ways nationality takes the place of race in Korea at certain times.
Korea moves very fast, and so I'm wondering, from that first time off the boat in 1996 when you traveled to Kyushu, or from Kyushu to Busan, compared to your time in Seoul from 1999 to 2000, did you note any big shifts, any big changes, how people talk to you, what people were talking about, even more basic infrastructure, fashion?
In 1996, I think that Korea and Japan socially, in terms of fashion, in terms of music, what I found to be different in 1990s was that Korea was really trying to pull itself away from that similarity. There was definitely a push for Korea to market itself as its own country outside of the prosperity of the Japanese culture that was being sold globally. And so in Korea, you started to see a connection between social culture, culture on the social level, with politics. So you have singers like Seo Tae-ji, who was very famous for giving normal lyrics. He had normal lyrics in his songs, but they had a sort of political message behind them. Jo Sun-mo, even G.O.D., H.O.T., they were all, in my view, trying to move towards creating this Korean side of pop industry that was a little bit different from the Japanese side.
Compared to, say, the late 1990s to now in 2017, could you describe the Black experience in South Korea and ways, both good and bad, that's evolved over the last 2 decades?
Wow, that's a really difficult question. In the first time that I came here, Black people weren't really something that was important for people to think of on a day-to-day basis. And so when they did see Black people, they would associate, okay, Michael Jackson, there are some pop fame with Black people, but they usually thought of us as entertainers. But they knew we weren't entertaining there. Okay. It didn't have that sort of feel that when they looked at me, they saw something evil or bad. That started a little bit later. In 1999, the military presence and the ability for military officers to go out of the base and into Korean society, and the lack of their preparation for dealing with cultural differences as they went outside of the base led to many social problems, to the point where the media started to make ties between color, nationality, race, ethnicity, everything. Anything that wasn't Korean that was doing a bad thing became a huge issue. And so the presence of the military, particularly in 1999, 2000, especially during this time, because Japan was trying to get rid, or there was rumors that Japan was trying to get rid of the Article 9 of their constitution and remilitarize, the presence of the military became more salient in people's eyes. They started to see, okay, we don't want Japan to militarize, but we have a double-edged sword now, because now these military officers are making social problems in our country. These social problems weren't really clearly identified, though. It became sort of a social presence that anyone who was foreign must be military, unless they look clearly not of Southeast Asian background or they were wearing a suit. So what you find is that Black people, they knew, many of them were military, so you didn't really see much of a change in their fashion. But what I saw was that from the 1996 to 1999, white men and white women would go out of their way to dress so that they don't look like a military person. And in some ways that helped further stigmatize this idea that if you were military, you were directly connected to all these negative things that people were stereotypically expecting from Black folks. In many ways, Black people just gave up on this idea of, I'm going to try to look like I'm not military. But then I met some other people who were from really amazing schools. Like I met one guy from Columbia University who was an English teacher here, Black guy. He would also wear suits wherever he went. And he told me that his reason for wearing these suits is because he knew that when people see him, they see him as a military person, and that is a bad thing. I would often ask him, why do you assume that this must be bad? And his reply would be, it doesn't matter. First impressions do matter. And first impressions in Korea, just like in other countries, I would actually argue perhaps more in Korea, matter more. And so to fit in, to be a part of this society without creating major problems, you do have to consciously be aware of what I look like on the outside. Is it easier now for Black people to live here? It is a little bit more obvious that Black people do live here and that not all of these Black people are military, because we do have several famous, one more famous one is Sam. I forget his last name, unfortunately, but he's from 비정상회담, which is a very famous show where they collected a group of foreign people living in the country to speak on certain issues. And so he speaks Korean really well. I have also been on the same show where I speak Korean, where they realize, oh, okay, not only are Black people not military, but some of them are actually interested in our culture and part of our culture at the same time.
What role do you think pop culture plays in removing stigmas and removing negative connotations about Black people in Asia, Korea specifically, but Asia more broadly? Do you think that it's been a positive change over the last few years as that show becomes more popular?
I wouldn't say it's because of that show, because that show only has one Black guy on it. But I think that in general, seeing race beyond simply ethnicity is something that still is extremely lacking in the country. The idea of there being a Black Korean is already well established because they do have Black celebrities here who are mixed with Korean and Black. There's one woman, In Suni, who I think I'm pronouncing her name right, but she's a famous singer who is biracial. And she's 100% Korean. She speaks Korean fluently. There's also a very, very famous African person from the Congo. I forget his name, even though we were on the same show. But he speaks Korean very fluently. His family came here, I believe, through as refugees into the country. There's also a professor who's, so I think that in some ways pop culture helps to broaden the spectrum of how many people know that this is practical and that that we exist in Korea. But I think that people actually being here and simply meeting more Black people, because there are a lot of Black people coming into the country in comparison to the 1990s, is really more effective than simply putting a couple of Black people on TV and then expecting society to change that way. In many cases, for example, China, because I lived there for a while as well, China never really had the overwhelming negative stigma of Black people. Just walking around in China, I feel a lot less objectified as some sort of, I don't know, like novelty, as well as just danger, right? A lot of times in Korea, I feel that people, when they look at me, even though they're very accepting, many people say they're very accepting of many things, they don't look at me with the idea that I can look past his color and deal with him. They look first at my color and then deal with me. And then once they realize I speak Korean, that's when they start to realize, okay, so he is sort of normal. And he can be talked to like a regular human being. But I think that in Korea, even though it's a very global country, many people have been outside of the country. They are primed through media, through this pop culture, to treat people differently. And that treatment is not... So when you say, is it positive? No, in many ways, it's not positive. It's very common in Korea for people to not give an effort when they are met with linguistic differences. Most cases in China, you can say something totally wrong, totally with all the wrong tones. Usually the listener will figure out what you're saying and then move on. In the case of Korea, I have had cases where because they see that I'm Black, they're not really listening to what I'm saying in Korean. It causes major problems where I'm like, okay, I'll ask something like, 이거 얼마요? Something like that. And they will just stop and just pursue this as if they had no idea that perhaps someone who doesn't look Korean can speak Korean. I very seldom had that problem in China.
Where do you think that comes from? I mean, why is your Blackness such an apparent obstacle for many Koreans to overcome?
I think that I might be a little bit unfair here. They're a little bit more in tune with the idea that you don't need to look like the ideal Chinese to speak Chinese or to be Chinese. Whereas in the case of Korea, for many, many, many years, they've taught their children that if you don't look and act a certain way, then you must not be, you must not exist as what it is that we're expecting. So you see this behavior, in my view, with a lot of things. Like, for example, if you're going to go golfing, you need to dress up and look like a golfer. If you're going to go hiking, you need to look like a hiker. So sometimes when I see people hiking in Korea, I wonder like if they're going up the Swiss Alps or something. Right?
They're ready to go up to Everest.
Right? Now. They put on all the get up and stuff to really, I guess to feel that they really are doing what they think they're doing, that they're doing it with the same spiritual mind that you would as a professional.
Can you walk us through the daily life of being Black in Korea? I mean, what is it like to make friends? What is it like to go to eMart? You mentioned you're at Seoul National University to study. Describe an average day for you.
Okay, it does really sound like a question of asking how does it feel to be driving while Black? And it does have repercussions, but identifying what are the foundational reasons or causation of how people treat you and saying that it must be color is always something that me as a Black person, I've been taught to try to avoid, to try to find other reasons for why people might be behaving the way they are, either uneducated, or not global enough to even understand or have an awareness of what color or how having a different color makes a person feel. In fact, in some ways, I would say that languagism, which is basically discrimination based on language, is probably a bigger factor than simply saying race, in that they're not separated from each other. The way of which I talk about race in Korea cannot be seen as mutually exclusive from language. And so when people see that I'm Black, that automatically means to them, I don't speak Korean. Okay. It doesn't necessarily conjure up any specific knowledge of why I'm doing anything, whatever it is that I'm doing, or how I might do that thing. What it does for them is it makes it into a situation of, I know for a fact that this guy is going to give me more trouble than I need because he clearly cannot speak Korean. I have had cases where I do speak Korean to people, and they have actually said to me, you didn't seem like you're a person who speaks Korean. And I've asked them, what does that mean? Where they would say, well, you just didn't look like you would speak Korean. Even though my Caucasian friend or my Asian looking friend would speak Korean perhaps even worse than me, they would say they just look like they speak Korean better than you. And they would usually express this very directly and say, but you speak really, really well. Which they don't realize that this is a form of discrimination, and it's a form of stereotyping of people based on color, which in many ways can be seen as racism. I've been on TV. In fact, I was on a recent show, 비정상회담, where they asked me to talk about police brutality in the United States. Recently, there were many killings related to officers and people who were being arrested. I went to the studio and they interviewed me. They had already previously interviewed me before related to a different show that I didn't do. But this one, they said that they wanted me on this show, which I didn't really understand because I hadn't lived in America for many years. So I don't really understand how it feels in America. So many times when we were doing the show, during the show, they would ask me, what does it feel like if you're driving and a police officer pulls you over? And I'm thinking to myself, well, hell, I'm from Detroit. It's all Black people. If they pull me over, he probably Black too. So I didn't really know what to say. And they said, what is the feeling of driving while Black? And I'm like, no, because I haven't driven while Black for God knows how long, 15 years. And many people, even during the show, they asked me, what is the most racist experience that you've had? And I've had two, and most of them had to do with entertainment. The first one was on this show, them picking me because I'm a Black guy from Detroit, asking me about Detroit. They asked me the context of something that had nothing to do with me as a person, simply because I'm a Black guy who speaks Korean. And I thought that was extremely racist, and they just didn't get it. So I was quite quiet during the whole show, to be honest. A lot of my friends, they're like, you're a pretty vocal person, even in Korean. You didn't say anything. And I kept thinking to myself, why am I on this show pretending to know something that I don't simply because I'm Black? The second time was SBS had me do some kind of special program where they were asking about fortune telling. And what would it be like if foreigners went to a fortune teller, these coffee fortune tellers? It was like booming during that time. It was like some sort of trend. And so we went to this coffee shop and they told my partner that she and I should not speak in Korean, even though both of us speak Korean. They told us, don't speak Korean, just act like you only speak English. And we said, okay, fine. I'm like, okay, fine. And so they asked me to go first. And so this guy asked me my age and the date of birth and all this other stuff. I didn't tell him the truth. But anyway, he decided to run through, you're going to have this bad thing and no one should be. It was all very negative, which I was thinking, okay, maybe it is true. But I gave him a faulty year and time and all of that anyway. And then afterwards, they panned over to my friend, and then she was told, okay, we want you to speak Korean. And so that's where I'm just like, well, what's going on here? Because I thought we couldn't speak Korean, and my Korean is actually much better than hers, right? And they were explaining to her many different things in Korean she couldn't understand, and so we had to actually stop the recording, and I had to explain to her what they were actually asking her to do. And then at the very end, I would always interject, what is going on? Because I'm actually participating in my own, in the discrimination against me, but because of my race, I felt. Because they're telling her to speak in Korean. I'm like, okay, I speak in Korean. Why am I not speaking in Korean? Basically wanted me to, in my view, portray the black guy who can't speak any Korean. But look, there's a white girl with blonde hair and blue eyes who can speak a little Korean. And it sort of allows this whole stereotyping notion of black and language skills to perpetuate in this society. And it's really bad. People don't see that racism may not be the type of racism we have in America where people are getting beaten up or abused or, physically hurt. Whereas here, linguagism and the treatment of people in such a negative way because of language differences is directly tied to that type of racism, where I'll have class where a professor will say to me randomly, do you understand? And it's a class in English. I'm like, what do you mean? Do I understand? Do you understand? Okay, cut that out.
As South Korea becomes more diverse, more colorful, more multicultural, where do you see acceptance of different cultures, different languages, different races going, let's say 10, 15, 20 years from now? Do you see the country becoming more accommodating, less accommodating?
I think one thing is I've always been against the idea of multiculturalism. I don't really know why we assume that cultures are monoliths. They're not. Korean culture, Japanese culture, all cultures are somewhat mixed with one another in certain ways, especially in the world we live in now with internet and, networked communities, for example. We will see. We are seeing more diversity in terms of certain things that can't be changed, like color, like race, like languages. But we're also seeing a very rapid pace of which those things are mixing with one another. I wouldn't necessarily say that's multiculturalism. I would say that it is creating new forms of diversity. And I think that color, for example, children that nowadays they're being called multicultural. The reason I don't like this is because when you say something is multicultural, in some ways you're also negating it from being part of the main culture. You're saying that it's mixed up with something else, which means that there are other things that are not mixed up. And in many ways, those things are seen as more supreme or better or higher valued than the mix, which is not really good, nor is it really true. In many cases, especially with children, they are not looking like they used to a long time ago. And that's beyond simply ethnicity and race. People are getting bigger, taller, they're eating better, right? Things are changing. But at the same time, you see that various ways of which people are marginalized. The anti-discrimination law that they have over multiple years tried to put in place has run into major problems. And I think that eventually conflict will create a need to have an understanding that discrimination exists here. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I'd like to pivot now to your dissertation research at Seoul National University. What is your dissertation about, and what are some elements of it that you could connect to broader Korean society?
Right now, what I'm dealing with is the LGBT community, particularly the G of the LGBT, which is gay community. It is a very well done topic, but not one that is done transnationally. And so I'm looking at how U.S. men who have come out in the closet in the United States deal with closets when they relocalize the notion of social stigma in the local geography of where it is that they're living, mainly in South Korea. I'm using a lot of ethnographic methodologies to understand how this marginalization is maintained, but also how, in what ways it can be better understood in order to break free from. What I'm trying to capture is the notion of a sociology of comfort. And I believe that in many ways, media and third spaces. Soja is a very famous geographer slash philosopher who came up with the idea of third spaces, which deals with these new spatial areas that don't really fall into the context of place. So, for example, the internet or the social communities that we have through our mobile phones. And marginalized people are taking advantage of these places to create alternate realities for themselves. But I am looking at whether those alternate realities position the people to further be stigmatized.
Yeah, in preparing for this interview, I read a research paper that you had published on the gay bean. First of all, can you tell us what the gay bean is and how that describes or how that connects into the gay community here in Seoul?
The gay bean. All right, what gay bean? Gay bean is actually a coffee bean and tea leaf, which is a fairly strong franchise in Korea for cafes. And this particular coffee bean is located in Jongno. And for years, since 1999, in fact, this place has been well known as being a gay, straight coffee bean, which to me was very confusing when I first heard about it, because I didn't know that there were straight places for gay people that didn't become gay. And so I did research to try to understand how this place was labeled gay, but at the same time maintain its heteronormative sort of qualities to it. And what I found is that, and this is why spatial dynamics and marginalization of people is very unique and interesting, is that people find and adjust methods to police themselves as a means of maintaining, again, this sociology of comfort, but at the same time finding peace of mind and being able to use the spatial elements within. And so the gay people who are attracted to gay being, because it really is an attraction, use this facility to feel not gay, but at the same time be gay. We are very much so motivated to ignore many parts of our identity. Even though we all have, if you look at intersectionality of identity, we have many elements of who we are. But in order to fit in certain spatial situations, we are always being forced to remove or perhaps even magnify certain parts of our identities so that this comfort zone or this comfort of social awareness isn't disrupted too much. So in the case of, for example, gay people living here, even though they're sometimes extremely open to their sexuality in the United States, once they arrive in Korea, they are forced to renegotiate, restructure, sometimes reorganize, or even come out of the closet again. So I'm looking at how this notion of closeted space affects the actual behavioral and psychological state of people who say that they're out of the closet, but then go to a new locale. So what are transnational closets, for example? The idea of selectively open, being selectively open with who knows and who doesn't know your sexuality affect the way you live in a foreign country. So some of my findings have shown that a lot of times language is a major factor here. And there are groups of marginalized people who specifically don't learn Korean because they don't want to deal with the Korean stigmatized notion of homosexuality. So their type of homophobia in this country is something that really is created through language, just like it is in the United States and many other countries. Being called a fag or, a homo or things like that exist also in Korea. And a lot of times what I've noticed is that Americans, when they come here, they love interacting with Koreans, but at the same time, they love maintaining the awareness that I've already come out of the closet. And the more that they learn Korean, the more they realize, oh my God, there's a different closet here, and now I'm in a different structured closet. In the United States, for example, a lot of times people say, I've come out of the closet. You'll hear them talk about, the linkage between coming out of the closet, living authentically, and telling your parents. Whereas in the case of Korea, especially after 1996, when they had the Asian financial crisis, before then, many people were telling their parents their notion of coming out of the closet was mirroring the image that they had seen in media in America, that you should tell your parents.
You mentioned previously this was from, say, the late 1980s to the Asian financial crisis. So you had kind of this 5-6 year window, right, where this was more common than before or after.
Right. 1996, when the Asian financial crisis happened. Before then, there were many people coming out of the closet. And then John Cho is a scholar of LGBT community who's at Sarah Lawrence College right now. He wrote a paper that basically found that those people who were coming out didn't have a social safety net after the financial crisis, and so they couldn't rely on their parents because they had already rejected the notion of family. And so really, in the case of Korea, telling certain people and being selectively open requires a different rubric for that selectivity than it does in the case of America. And what I've seen through the people that I've interviewed is that as you start to live here and as you start to acclimate to the social, way of thinking based also through language, you also start to realize that what coming out means here, structured around what coming out may mean in the United States on a social level, are extremely different from one another. And so I'm dealing specifically with how people who are marginalized and then further marginalized, not only by being foreigners, but also by being linguistically not as attuned as the natives, or even, for example, racially different, adjust to this notion of sexuality, which they all share. Do they share it equally? Do they deal with the social stigma behind this sexuality in ways that do connect the intersectionality between people? Because often the research that is done related to sexuality sort of forgets the idea that, the way that Blacks and whites are treated are different. And then the contextual difference between the fact that if you're in Asia, the way that you see different colors and also different nationalities and also different job titles is extremely different than the case in the United States.
How does homophobia and, say, stigma surrounding the homosexual community differ in Korea specifically than other Asian countries or North America?
I think that it really depends on the country you're talking about. For example, Asia, if you're talking about Thailand, they have a totally different view of gender. Sexuality is almost always connected in some ways to gender. There's a lot of arguments about non-binary sexualities, but the way of which people will generally understand sexual identity in the case of Korea, a lot of times there's a lot of emphasis placed on the political, that this is a political statement, that it goes beyond simply talking about who you're actually having sex with. This is something that is part of a movement. And so the younger generation, who are a lot more attuned with what sexuality could mean, not necessarily what it actually means, have a very, very different view of what it means to say you're gay, what it means to say you're lesbian, than the older generation. A lot of the older generation don't necessarily see it as a part of living, but rather as a part of asserting yourself. And in some ways, assertion, especially in Korea, saying who you are, what you are, is almost contrary to the notion of social harmony. So it's like, well, we're all just trying to get along. Why do I need to know about where you're putting, your genitalia? Why would you even tell me that? And they don't understand that the closet itself is a real stigma. It is a psychological state that does literally affect your social living. America is moving into an area where it's being called post-gay. And that is a fallacy. And I try to explain it sometimes, and I don't really like this analogy, but I try to explain it as trying to hide something that you actually like. And sometimes even like foods, if you like a certain type of food, but I don't want to say that this is just about some objectification of, sweets and sours or something like that. But it really is a case of not knowing how people will react to who you are as a person. And in the case of the United States, we have gone to a point where we believe that there's always a way of finding connections, and there's always a way to live with, this problem, or not necessarily a problem that you're living with, the state of being different. Whereas in Korea, difference really can be problematic in people's social lives. In the United States are very well taught that we always have a social safety net. Even without families, you can live, you can do it, you can survive. There's not a problem. You don't really need to have friends. You can be a loner and still make it in the world. Korea is not really structured in that way. In many ways, you do need people for a lot of things, even to be considered normal. The idea of being a 30-year-old and not married, for example, comes with a certain stigma to it. The idea of being a woman and not yet already having a baby, applying for a job, can be totally damaging to you as a person, because they basically won't hire you because they're thinking, okay, at some point she must have a child. It's almost seen as a national duty. Being normal and that being essential to being a good person is extreme in the case of Korea. And so living stigmatized, living marginalized, and dealing with that cross-culturally needs to be studied a great deal more. And I'm trying to help in that effort.
Legislatively speaking, America has moved quite quickly in the last 10, 15 years on gay rights, marriage rights. Do you see that impacting Korean society, whether from a legal perspective or from an acceptance perspective, or is what's going on in America the last few years completely separate from Korea?
I don't think anything with sexual movements are ever really completely separate, unless you're just blind to what's going on in the world. With the internet and Facebook and these different multimedia sort of connections, social connections that we have, it's almost impossible to totally ignore what's going on from one country to the next, especially in the case of Korea, where many times you're watching just normal television programs like news, and they'll talk about, oh my God, people in Korea are getting fat. And then they'll zoom over to America and explain, the effects of fast food in America, which to me is quite shocking. I always wonder, like, why are they talking about America when, their issue is Korea? So the connections there, and also with sexuality, is something that is heavily influential between the two countries, not simply just one to the other. A lot of times when we address this, we think that, it must be from the developed country to the developing or the lesser developed country. And so this is how it happens. But in actuality, in the case of Korea, especially with gay marriages, it was something that was mentioned here. There was a very strong movement for people to do it. There was a staged sort of marriage between two men in the country. You do have an outing of a very famous gay celebrity. You do have transgenders and transsexuals who are promoting, acceptance and understanding. But at the same time, what you do find is that what it means is actually still unclear. So you have people who are identifying as being gay, but then you're not really sure what gay means, or they're not sure what gay means in the context of their own country. The political and the social are heavily influenced from one another, but they're not necessarily developing in a linear fashion with another country. It's just issue specific in many cases. I personally believe that you really need to have domestic dynamic conflict before you will really see efforts towards diversity, efforts towards genuine acceptance. Even in the United States, you have a lot of symbolic things that are going on, which are definitely, positive, which definitely helps people in their lives. But you also see social areas where there's further stigmatization of, having a certain sexuality. Particularly in the case of Korea, after Hong Seok-cheon, who's probably the most well-known celebrity who identifies as being gay, what you had after that, you had a lot of other people who were coming out, who were younger, who didn't actually experience the Asian financial crisis, who weren't, pushed to really negotiate between whether my coming out is living authentically or whether my coming out is actually throwing away my family and you see a higher rate of suicide, you see a higher rate of homelessness, right? Youth who are homeless. And there are efforts to help these people. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but at the same time, I don't want to give false optimism that simply because we are talking about these issues, that means that we are positively and constructively dealing with the issues at the same time. In many ways, we are not. We are saying, for example, even in the United States, you're gay, that's the end of discussion. You're just gay. There's nothing wrong with gay, but then actually taking the effort to figure out what that means on the practical level, what that means in terms of behavioral patterns, or just what does it mean to be gay, and should we pursue understanding that more?
What does being gay mean in Korea?
Wow, I don't know. If I knew that, I'd probably be done with my life's work. I think that is something that is always changing. And in many ways, Stephen O'Murray and also Greenberg are famous writers. One wrote Homosexualities, the other one wrote The Construction of Homosexuality, which basically, especially The Construction of Homosexuality, is basically geared around the idea of how do people who identify as being gay or same-sex loving deal with homophobia. And so to understand what does it mean to be gay, in some ways you do have to understand what is homophobia in Korea. And because Korea is not structured in the same way with masculinity as it is in the United States, masculinity is extremely weak in America. The idea of a man losing, for example, a man can easily lose his masculinity just by being rubbed on the arm by another man. In the case of Korea, touching and, and literal and intimacy in terms of physical contact with one another, even same sex, not necessarily lovers, but just same sex is very common. And so the triggers of what it is that makes a person gay or not gay, in other words, the phobias that they're living constantly wondering or aware of, are very different, which in many cases cause people to define themselves in terms of gay as being very different. Let me put this more in a practical way, and I think you will understand a little bit clearer. There are groups of gays in Korea, because they know that the stigma of being gay, they basically hide away from the idea that there is any connection between the bodies, because that's seen as being a very dirty thing. And that has bothered me when I was studying for my master's. I did it on bisexuality. And what I noticed is that when people talk about sexuality, when you add in the physical aspect of sexuality, that's when the understanding of sexuality becomes extremely unclear. And so what I gathered from a lot of the gay individuals that I interviewed in Korea, who are Korean, they would basically either hide or avoid talking about any kind of physical intimacy. They would even sort of project the homophobia and the stigmas that they live around or live behind. And so I realized, okay, to be gay here, what does it mean if you're not having sex? Is it just same-sex loving? Is it the amount of intimacy? Is it, a physical attraction without any physicality? It is not very different in the case of America either.
So this is a really, I think, underappreciated aspect of society in Korea and life in Korea, and most likely not something that most Koreans are even comfortable or seeking to talk about. What are some challenges that you encounter when you say you meet an average Korean or you meet a fellow Ph.D. student at Seoul Day and you tell them, this is what I study, this is what I'm writing my dissertation on?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I would have to say, in terms of a scholar, in terms of the scholarship that I do, I am very selective with how I explain that I study LGBT issues. I am interested in both women and men. I'm also interested in sexual liminal spaces. But I've noticed that when you say you're interested in this area, many people, because I'm Black, and like I said, because of the eroticism of my Black body, I'm a big, muscular Black man. So they wonder, oh, so is he is he a person who's pursuing this because of his own sexual preferences or something like that?
So in a similar way that it's difficult to disconnect the color of your skin. It's also difficult to disconnect your research interests from some sort of inherent deviance or personal preferences.
Exactly. And usually when they do sort of mention ideas like that, I explain that I also do studies on lesbians, and I don't think I'm a lesbian or a transsexual. My real reason for studying this area is mainly because I am clearly marginalized. I am not considered a threat to many people. I at first was quite shocked at how many marginalized groups of people that I have easily created relationships with. I mean, gangsters will walk up to me and want to be friends, and you realize how human they are.
This is in Seoul, not Detroit.
In Seoul, in Itaewon, which is a very famous area where a lot of military soldiers hang out. Because I speak Korean, that just sort of adds to the idea that, okay, not only is he not a threat to people who themselves in Korean society, like gangsters, are considered a threat, but he also can also speak in my language, which makes it very easy for me to interview people like prostitutes, people who have had very irregular jobs, for example, people on the run. Sometimes it's easy to even gain access to what it is that, they are living, how they are living. In terms of my studies, I actually am very interested and wanted to write my master's thesis on gay identity in Korea, in the country. And I realized that just because people are gay, identify as gay and identify as marginal, and they don't necessarily want you studying about them. And so I encountered many difficulties with my interpretation of gay behavior and what people wanted me to say about them. And so I really did fall into the predicament of, should I be the good anthropologist who stays away from my subject, even though I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a sociologist, but should I stay away from my subject, observe them from a distance, or should I use the participatory, observant sort of behavior of being really one with them and trying to understand them and also pinpoint who or what they are? And I found that in the latter, it's really hard to do that because people are not really comfortable with how you capture their identity and what elements of their identity they feel are most salient, or not necessarily what the researcher feels. So in the future, I will write about the notion of gay identity in Korea, but I feel that as a PhD student trying to do so, I just don't have the resources, for one. And at the same time, trying to understand a subject or people with a similar background might be a little bit easier, and at the same time, just as fruitful. So I see it as a step, like understanding, gay identity from Americans in Korea as a step to understanding the interrelationship between the two, because gay identity itself is not really necessarily a Korean identity, even though same-sex relations and behavior has been in Korea probably as long as Korean people have been here. The notion of saying I am gay is a very much non-Korean notion, or at least in the view of current modern Koreans, that this is not something that is native to our country. I think that it definitely needs a lot more study, but it needs a lot more, it needs more resources.
Is it possible that, say, a particularly flamboyant or a gay or lesbian person that fits the stereotype of what Americans think is gay and lesbian, does coming to Asia or does coming to Korea actually give them a little bit of a shield, a little bit of a barrier, where you can wear or dress or act even in certain ways that in the US, oh yeah, he's gay, or oh yeah, she's so butch, right? But that here, you don't have that because they just are not making that connection, right? You have different interpretations of say fashion and facial expressions and even hand gestures, right? So I guess what I want to ask is, like, does that create a kind of shield, might not be the best word, but shield, or I guess openness, that foreigners specifically can actually be even more themselves within the gay community here?
Masculinity in the United States, again, going back to the flimsiness of it all, we as Americans have a preoccupation with the notion of being masculine. Whereas in other countries, particularly in Korea in this case, that preoccupation is not as seen as much as a threat. This has to do with the history of sexuality in the United States, which extends from queers to the AIDS scare and bisexuality, and the notion that, oh my God, if you are having sex with men, then and also with women, that, it could lead to disease and all that sort of history is really not here. It's something that is very, very weak in terms of it not having enough masculinity means that you're definitely going to be a sexual predator or do something bad to my children. Of course, that is slightly here because they do have certain notions over gay people and the ones who are teaching their children. There is room for not just avoiding the homophobias that exist in the United States, but there is room just as a traveler to recontextualize who you are as a person. So some people actually do come to Korea with the idea of, I'm going to be a different person. I'm going to live a different persona. And that fades over time because it's really difficult to change who you are, especially if you're coming as 20-year-old, 30-year-old. So yeah, I mean, there are social safety areas and safe spaces here that would not be so safe in certain places in the United States. There are also places of danger and places of insecurity here. A lot of times when you're talking about sexuality, because there's no real history of employment security, the idea of being a model person or having a certain sexuality, your employer being okay with that, is really something that is a major issue right now. And that is one of the reasons why the anti-discrimination law that they tried to, or discrimination act that they tried to enact, has gotten a lot of attention, because there are people who are living here and it really is affecting their real lives because they can't get jobs or even keep jobs. But a lot of that legislation is pushed to the side because of the grassroots and the strength of Christian organizations here, extremely right-wing, and their right-wing being any sort of sexual diversity is not necessarily something that they can accept.
That's interesting, because in the U.S., a lot of anti-gay sentiment definitely comes from religion, specifically the evangelical community. There's just a revelation the other day that the Mormon Church was actively funding Prop 8 measurements, which was the famous bill that basically disallowed for gay marriage in California several years ago. And so I'm curious, could you expand a little bit on that connection here in Korea? I mean, specifically, I'm wondering, are there actually networks of evangelical or, say, Christian communities in the U.S., maybe the Korean American community, that are actually funneling money into campaigns to promote, I don't know if you want to call it pro-discriminatory policies, but prevent a normalization or prevent equality in the law books here?
I don't know if it's Korean American per se, but the Anglican Church of Korea is a very strong group politically. And you do have to understand that Korea, it has a really high percentage of Christians who live in the country, and they interpret homosexuality as being a sin. And so many of the efforts for getting anti-discrimination legislation passed, even recently, I think it was maybe 1 month ago, Moon Jae-in, during one of his meetings, he actually explained that he would be promoting the anti-discrimination legislation, but he would not be okay with the provision that includes homosexuals or non-traditional sexualities. During this meeting, and what you find in Korea is that the feminist, which is quite interesting, is feminism and feminists believe, and they have every right to believe, that discrimination should be gotten rid of as it applies to them. but at the same time, they take it as a two-stage approach in that first, women equality, and then second, all the other stuff. And so during this meeting, there were activists who were protesting, saying, that this legislation should include, lesbians and transgender LGBT people and non-traditional sexualities. The women in the group, many of which were feminists who were listening to Moon Jae-in, started yelling back to the protesters saying, 나중에, 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 which basically means later, later. So in other words, we are going to push this for feminists, and we support Moon Jae-in because he's pushing this to make women's equalities, but we're not going to tag that with sexual equality as well. There's this general view that we should have equality at a slow pace. And so because Korea, on a social level, we don't really want to know about someone's sexuality, if we include this anti-gay part or this anti-lesbian or transgender, part to the anti-discrimination, then we're also saying it's okay for you to tell us about your sexuality, which our society, and many of them say it just like this, our society is not ready for that.
Okay, so we're getting towards the end of the interview. I'm going to hit you with a few rapid-fire questions. You can take as long or as little time to answer them as you'd like.
Why are they called rapid-fire then?
If another African American asked you, should I come to Korea to study? Should I come to Korea to work? Should I come to Korea to visit? What would you tell them?
Yeah. Why not?
Okay, done. Yeah. Easy.
Yeah. Why not? Unlike white people, I don't know where this black person coming from, but I came from an all-black city, and racism is everywhere, and we're pretty well attuned to the idea that it will exist. How it manifests itself is very different, and how we can react to it. I think that I would probably be more apprehensive of a white man from an all-white neighborhood coming to Korea thinking that, where he's from is going to be very similar to where he's going, and the culture shock that might be implied with that. In the case of black people, I don't think that it's going to be a hugely shocking experience. I've seen YouTubes of certain African Americans here who have fallen into the trap of certain social sort of tricks of the trade, where they say, like, there's one woman who said, they wanted to make her into an actress or something, or a pop star, and
she was a black woman.
Yes, she was a black woman. She ended up going to some bar or something to do a quote unquote audition, which was not an audition. They were actually probably using her as some sort of Western geisha for the men who might be, or kiseng in Korean, for the men who might be going to the bar to entertain them or something. And she didn't know that, bad people exist here. But I don't think that her reaction is just because she's black. I think it could have happened to a white person as well. So in all honesty, yeah, I think black people, particularly for me coming here, what I learned is not that I'm black. I learned, hell, I'm American too. I didn't know that. That's something that I didn't know what it felt like to be American, not just in a positive light, because I kind of knew that through media. The negative light, like you say you're American and you expect people to just sort of say, oh, cool, an American. No, I've met people when I'm meeting them with my French friends who say, oh, you're American, and totally ignore me. And then talk to my French friend or my Chinese friend and then talk about how much they have connections. And when I ask them, have you been to France? Have you been to China? They say no.
If you had to fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck...
Oh, that sounds similar to what a politician was recently asked.
It's also a very similar question on a previous podcast episode of this show. Which would you choose and why?
I can't remember what he said as his answer to this question. I have to answer this literally?
Yeah.
Or is it
yes, literally. Walk us through. So, one horse-sized duck.
Why do they have to be different races? What's up with this racial thing? Okay, well.
I can ask you a different question if you prefer.
No, go ahead.
So, it's more of a size thing more than a difference in species. So, one horse-sized duck, or would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses. So what would you rather fight as a Taekwondo master?
How can I look at this question? I guess I would probably choose the latter, mainly because
100 duck-sized horses.
100 duck-sized horses, mainly because I would see, for me, the horse image. Now, I might be over embellishing this, but I see them as every time I have a fight, I get something positive from it. And so a horse, to me, has that sort of positivity to it. And so every little fight, because you didn't say they're all attacking me at one time, right? Which every horse, and I do this on a daily basis, I deal with horses every day. And
on the main streets of Seoul.
Yes, and they're all little horses. And every single time I encounter them, I have my fight, I win, and I learn a little bit more from that fight. The idea of me as an academic always needing to learn from what came before, I feel that by the end, by that 99th horse, I would have attained so much more from just having that one fight with that one big animal. And so that's why I would choose the smaller ones, every single one of them, but not at one time.
That's a great answer. That's a really good answer.
Yes, what I live every day. Every day I wake up and I go outside and I just wonder which horse and what color, how many fights, right? Because it's not just one horse. It's usually one or two or maybe 5 horses a day. And that's how I basically I live in Korea every single day. I do not wake up going outside knowing that I'm not going to have a challenge. And that's one of the reasons why I live here. If I just wanted to fight that one big dog, a horse-sized dog, I don't think I would be able to survive so long here. Every day I know I'm going to be dealing with a couple of hundred horses. So when you said 100 horses, I'm thinking more like probably 1,000. I've gone through 1,000. I've learned from every single fight.
Do you plan to spend the rest of your life here in South Korea?
That is a very interesting question. My parents basically passed away within the last 3 years. And I technically do not have a home because of this. And it has changed my view of living home and all of this when we talk about family. And it's one of the things I'm writing with transnational clauses is the notion of having a family where you are, where you've been, and where you're going to be. And the notion of geography is changing very, very rapidly. And for me, when you say, am I always going to be here? Are you going to live here for the rest of your life? I'm going to live in America for the rest of my life, but I haven't been there for 20 years. And so even if I went back to America for 20, 30 years, yeah, I'll still in some ways be living a part of my life in Korea. So yeah, to me, it's not the best question because it doesn't really frame it in a way that's real. And the reality is that we are interconnected. And even my best friends in America are still my best friends, and we still contact each other. And so distance is really, really changing very, very rapidly. And so, yeah, like wherever I go, Japan, China, United States will all be part of where I live.
If you could put up a billboard in the busiest intersection in Seoul, what would it say on it and why?
Just embrace difference or embrace change. Both changes back to what were and changes to what could be. So it's not something that means, everybody should change. You should become more like me. No. What I'm trying to promote here is the idea of thinking about where you are.
Okay, last question. What are 3 books that you would recommend to better understand sexuality, homosexuality, gender in South Korea or more broadly Asia in general?
Wow, that's a big question. Only 3 books, though, I think wouldn't even scratch the surface of understanding any of this. But I might have to recommend, in the case of Asia, there's a book called Queer Japan from the Pacific War to the Internet Age. It's by Mark McLeland. It's a really good book that talks about sexuality in Japan, and he actually does mention this notion that gay, for example, doesn't have the same contextual meaning as it does in Japan as you would expect in the Western sort of societies. There's 2 other books that I think that they kind of conflict with each other, and because they conflict with each other, it's quite interesting. One I already mentioned was Homosexualities, which is by Stephen O'Murray, which basically asserts this notion that social historical particularism is important in understanding how there are different types of homosexuality around the world. So he calls those sexualities, so homosexualities, not just one homosexuality. And then there's Dennis Altman, who's very famous for global sex. And he sort of looks at this global notion of sexuality in the global context. And he's also written another book recently last year called Queer Wars, which stages it in that way. And it's quite interesting, the different approach to looking at sexuality as a global as opposed to a local phenomenon, and how we are able to deal with the difference between the two. But there are many other books that I think could help a real beginner for learning about sex and sexuality and performance and performativity, for example.
Robert, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I don't know if I answered all the questions properly, but it was fun to ramble on about my studies, I guess.